Satellites orbit this planet every day, and some of them are still photographing a war. Not a war with soldiers or front lines. A war the Soviet Union waged against its own rivers, deserts, and mountains. Decades later, the damage is visible from orbit. There is a sea that used to be the size of a small country. Today, it is just an outline on old maps. There is a lake nearby so contaminated that standing at its edge for about an hour could reportedly kill you. This is what happens when a superpower decides nature is another 5-year plan. Start with the sea. In the 1960s, the Aral Sea was the 4th largest lake on Earth, sitting between what is now Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Soviet planners looked at it and saw something else entirely: wasted water. 2 rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, fed into it. Planners diverted both to irrigate cotton fields across Central Asia. Cotton was called white gold. The quotas were enormous, and Moscow wanted them met. The irrigation worked, at least on paper. Cotton exports rose for years, and Soviet planners treated the rising numbers as proof they'd made the right call. But the sea, depending on those rivers, had no plan of its own. It simply started shrinking, slowly at first, then fast enough that fishing crews noticed the water pulling back from their own docks within a single generation. By the 1990s, it had split into disconnected, smaller lakes, with the southern basin retreating so far that some ports ended up more than 100 kilometers from open water. This wasn't a drought. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was an engineered collapse, built one irrigation canal at a time, approved in offices thousands of kilometers from the water it was draining. What's left is the Uralkum Desert, a stretch of dry seabed roughly the size of a small country, where there used to be open water deep enough for cargo ships. Near towns like Aralsk and Moynak, rusted fishing boats sit stranded in sand, kilometers from any shoreline, some of them repainted now for tourists who come specifically to see a fleet that will never sail again. Kazakhstan built a dam in 2005 that has partially revived the northern portion of the sea, bringing back some fish stocks and a fraction of the old fishing economy. The southern half, mostly in Uzbekistan, is largely gone, and much of the exposed seabed is a toxic, salt-crusted plain that kicks up dust storms, carrying pesticide residue and salt into nearby towns. Fishing towns that once shipped catch across the entire USSR now sit hundreds of kilometers from the nearest water. Their harbors are sand. That sea disappeared because of what the Soviets pulled out of the land. The next site is contaminated by what they poured into it. In the Ural Mountains, near the city of Chelyabinsk, there's a small lake called Karachay. It doesn't look dangerous. It looks almost peaceful. But some scientific reports have described it as one of the most radioactively contaminated places on the planet. According to some estimates, simply standing at its shore for around an hour could deliver a fatal radiation dose, though exact figures vary depending on the source. Karachay was part of Mayak, a secret plutonium production complex built starting in 1948 to feed the Soviet nuclear weapons program in the earliest, most urgent years of the Cold War arms race. The complex didn't exist on any public map. Entire towns nearby were left off Soviet maps too. Their populations working on a program most of them weren't allowed to fully understand. The lake became a dumping ground for high-level liquid nuclear waste, a fast, cheap solution while engineers figured out something more permanent. It was supposed to be temporary. It never was. In 1957, a storage tank at the complex exploded when a cooling system failure allowed waste inside to overheat. The Kyrgyzstan disaster contaminated a wide surrounding region and remains one of the worst nuclear accidents in history, on par with Chernobyl in radioactive material released, though far less known internationally. For decades, the Soviet government hid it from the public entirely, and some Western intelligence agencies reportedly stayed quiet about it too, not wanting to reveal how much they knew about Soviet nuclear operations. Authorities eventually tried to control Lake Karachay itself by filling parts of it with concrete blocks and soil, attempting to stop radioactive dust from blowing off the exposed surface during dry seasons. The area is still restricted today, decades after the accident that made it famous. A lake built to fuel a nation's sense of military strength became one of the most dangerous places a human being could physically stand. One reversal came from a leak nobody could stop. The next one came from an island nobody was even supposed to know existed. Back in the Aral Sea, before it shrank, there was an island called Vozrojdenia. The name means rebirth. It's one of the darker jokes in Soviet history, because for decades, this island hosted one of the USSR's most secretive biological weapons testing programs, run under a project that publicly claimed to research vaccines while privately weaponizing disease. From the 1950s into the 1990s, the military tested pathogens there in the open air, including anthrax, isolated from the world by water on every side, and chosen specifically because that isolation made containment simple. Then the water disappeared. As the Aral Sea kept shrinking, tied directly to the same irrigation collapse destroying the sea itself, the island stopped being an island. By the early 2000s, it had physically merged with the mainland. Ground once sealed off by miles of open water became something people could simply walk to. Teams from the United States and Kazakhstan carried out decontamination efforts in the early 2000s, focused on burial sites containing anthrax. How complete that cleanup actually was remains uncertain in public records. What's clear is this: the same engineering failure that killed a sea also erased the last natural barrier protecting people from a weapons testing ground. That location ties two disasters into one. The next one is a hole in the ground that was supposed to close within weeks, and instead burned for decades. In the Karakum desert of Turkmenistan, there is a crater that has been on fire for years. Locals call it the door to hell. The commonly told version of its origin says Soviet engineers were drilling for natural gas in the 1970s when the ground beneath a rig collapsed into a hidden gas pocket. To stop the site from releasing toxic methane into nearby communities, they set it on fire, expecting it to burn out within days. It's worth noting that some researchers and Turkmen officials have disputed parts of this story, including the exact date, but the fire itself is real, and it never went out. What was supposed to be a short, controlled burn has now lasted for decades, quietly outliving the Soviet Union itself and the generation of engineers who lit it. The crater, roughly 70 meters wide, became a strange kind of national attraction, drawing tourists deep into the desert to camp beside it and watch flames rise out of open ground at night. Turkmen officials have talked about extinguishing it at various points, including statements in recent years suggesting the fire wastes valuable gas reserves the country could otherwise sell. But as of the most recent public reporting, it was still burning. A hole meant to be sealed within days has now outlasted the government that dug it. That fire came from drilling too aggressively into the ground. The next scar came from drilling straight down, just to see how far down would go. On the Kola Peninsula in Russia, Soviet scientists began drilling in 1970 with one goal: go deeper into the Earth's crust than anyone ever had. This wasn't about oil or gas. It was about outdoing the Americans, who were attempting something similar. It was raw scientific ambition wrapped in Cold War competition. They succeeded, technically. The Kola Superdeep Borehole reached roughly 12.2 kilometers down, over 40,000 feet, making it the deepest artificial point ever created by humans, deeper than the ocean's deepest trench. It remains the deepest borehole on Earth to this day, decades after drilling ended. Then, in the 1990s, drilling stopped. Not because of a discovery of anything sinister buried below, despite internet rumors that later claimed engineers had heard sounds from the depths and found something they weren't supposed to. The real explanation was less dramatic. It stopped because temperatures deep underground were far higher than predicted, hot enough to make the rock behave more like plastic than solid stone, and because the Soviet Union itself was collapsing, taking its funding and its scientific ambition down with it. The site was abandoned. The hole was eventually welded shut. The buildings around it fell apart, left to rust in the cold. The deepest hole ever drilled by human beings now sits capped and mostly forgotten, a monument to a country that stopped existing before its own experiment finished. That was ambition running out of money before it ran out of curiosity. The next site is ambition that actually succeeded and poisoned an entire river system in the process. In Kyrgyzstan, near a town called Mailuu-Suu, there are dozens of uranium waste dumps sitting in an active seismic and landslide zone. Environmental groups, including past assessments from organizations like the Blacksmith Institute, have listed it among the most polluted places on Earth. Starting in 1946, Soviet operations mined and processed uranium here, reportedly supplying material for the USSR's earliest atomic weapons program, at a time when the entire project was treated as a matter of national survival. When mining stopped between the 1960s and 1990s, the leftover radioactive tailings, close to 2 million cubic meters of them by some estimates, were simply left behind in more than 30 open-air dumps, sitting near rivers, on unstable ground that regularly shifts and slides during earthquakes and heavy rain. The same geological instability the Soviets built around now threatens to do the damage the mining itself never finished. A landslide or flood could release radioactive material directly into shared Central Asian water sources. International remediation programs, including World Bank-backed efforts reported through the 2010s and into the 2020s, have worked to stabilize and relocate the waste. A resource pulled out of the ground for weapons now threatens to leak back into the rivers of an entire region. A slow-motion accident, decades delayed, still waiting to finish. That's contamination waiting to happen. The final scar is contamination the whole world already watched happen, live. In northern Ukraine, there's a 30-kilometer radius around a power plant where an entire modern city was evacuated in under 2 days and never resettled. From space, it still shows up as a distinct dead zone, cutting sharply against the farmland surrounding it. The city was Pripyat, built in 1970 to house workers at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and their families. It was designed as a flagship of Soviet nuclear confidence, a model socialist city with wide boulevards, an amusement park, and modern apartment blocks, representing atomic energy as the clean, modern future the USSR had promised its people. Nearly 50,000 people eventually lived there, most of them tied directly to the plant. In April 1986, Reactor 4 exploded during a safety test that went wrong. It became the worst civilian nuclear disaster in history, releasing radioactive fallout across large parts of Europe and forcing the evacuation of Pripyat within about 36 hours. So fast that residents were told they'd be back in a few days and left personal belongings behind. A symbol built to prove humanity's mastery over the atom instead became the clearest proof of how fast that mastery can collapse. The area became a heavily restricted exclusion zone. Years later, regulated tourism opened up parts of it to visitors, at least before more recent disruptions in the region changed access again. Scientists studying the zone found something unexpected. With humans gone, some wildlife populations actually rebounded, even amid lingering contamination. A city built to showcase total human control became the strongest evidence of how quickly that control can disappear. And nature, not people, is what quietly moved back in. Every one of these places was supposed to prove Soviet mastery over nature. Instead, together, they proved the opposite. None of these disasters happened in isolation. A sea drained for cotton, a lake poisoned to build weapons, an island exposed by the same collapse that killed the sea beside it, a fire that never learned how to stop, a hole drilled straight down until money and time ran out, waste left behind in ground that won't stay still, a city built for a future that lasted exactly one night. Each one looked, at the time, like proof of progress. A nation feeding its own people through irrigation. A nation defending itself through weapons research. A nation proving its scientific reach by drilling farther than anyone else ever had. Different decades, different regions, same underlying belief. That nature was an obstacle to be scheduled, drained, drilled, or detonated into submission, one project at a time. And that the consequences, if they ever arrived, would arrive on someone else's watch. The Soviet Union collapsed decades ago. The rivers it rerouted are still rerouted. The lakes it poisoned are still poisoned. The ground it hollowed out is still hollow. Satellite photos taken today still show the ghost outline of the Aral Sea's original shoreline, a body of water that existed for tens of thousands of years and was erased in under 50. The Soviet Union is gone. Its 5-year plans expired decades ago. But the water it rerouted, the ground it poisoned, and the hole it drilled straight into the crust are all still there, doing exactly what they were left to do, sitting quietly, waiting to be noticed again. The war is over. The evidence never left.